President Trump will speak with Ukrainian President Zelensky as they work toward a deal to end the Russia-Ukraine war.
Yesterday in Beijing marked the first time that Russian President Vladimir Putin met with the leaders of China and North Korea. The first time they were all in place at the same time. And this was President Trump's message to Vladimir Putin when asked yesterday at the White House.
Breaking from his usual stance, President Donald Trump delivered an unusually sharp rebuke of Russian President Vladimir Putin. Sources inside the White House point to a dramatic shift in strategy. But is this all part of Trump's master plan? Or has he finally decided to call out Putin's games? Let's break it down. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's visit to the White House on Friday, February 28th, was intended to be a strategic meeting to solidify U.S. support for Kyiv. Instead, the highly anticipated visit took a dramatic and damaging turn. A public and heated confrontation between Vice President J.D. Vance and President Zelensky overshadowed the event, leaving the U.S.-Ukraine relationship in a precarious state. This tense exchange further strained an already fragile alliance, especially as it follows President Donald Trump's recent concessions to Russian leader Vladimir Putin moves that have so far not benefited the United States. The fallout marks a significant setback for Ukraine and a worrying development for U.S. national security. If Ukraine is forced into a disadvantageous peace deal or suffers defeat, the consequences could extend far beyond its borders, encouraging the Kremlin and increasing the long-term threat to Europe and American interests. As a result, European leaders are scrambling to reassess their strategy and question whether the United States is still a reliable partner in Ukraine's defense. On Sunday, European officials met with Zelensky for emergency talks to explore ways to salvage Western unity and re-engage the U.S. in meaningful dialogue. However, with President Trump showing little willingness to reverse course, there is growing anxiety that American aid could be completely withdrawn. Zelensky had arrived in Washington with a proposed deal intended to capture President Trump's attention. Grant the U.S. a strategic advantage in developing Ukraine's vast, rare earth mineral reserves. The groundwork for negotiations had seemingly been laid earlier in the week, with French President Emmanuel Macron and British Prime Minister Keir Starmer meeting Trump to discuss potential pathways to ending the Russia-Ukraine war. Initially, the White House meeting proceeded smoothly, but tensions erupted after an extended press briefing when Vice President J.D. Vance, who has previously dismissed Ukraine's fate as inconsequential, launched a surprise verbal attack on Zelensky. The tense confrontation between Vice President Vance and President Zelensky quickly escalated, leaving the talks in complete disarray. The meeting collapsed, and observers noted Vance's visible satisfaction. President Trump then abruptly canceled a planned lunch, and the rare earth minerals agreement was left unsigned. In a stunning breach of diplomatic protocol, Zelensky was reportedly asked to leave, making this one of the most humiliating moments in recent U.S. foreign policy. The public snub of a key ally, one that has endured 3 years of brutal Russian aggression, is alarming on its own. However, it becomes even more significant when viewed alongside the Trump administration's recent concessions to Moscow. Over the past 3 weeks, the White House has repeatedly aligned itself with Russian interests, often at Ukraine's expense. For instance, on February 12th, Trump openly suggested that Ukraine would not regain all of its occupied territories or join NATO, effectively endorsing 2 of Putin's key demands before negotiations had even begun. The same day, he broke with Western allies by announcing plans to meet with Putin, despite the diplomatic isolation imposed on Russia since its 2014 annexation of Crimea. The pattern of concessions continued. The next day, Trump advocated for Russia's reinstatement into what was once the G8, and days later, he made the baseless claim that Ukraine had provoked the war. Then, U.S. officials reportedly blocked a G7 statement condemning Russian aggression on the 3rd anniversary of Moscow's full-scale invasion. In a move that shocked international observers, the U.S. also joined Russia, North Korea, and Iran in voting against a UN resolution that identified Moscow as the aggressor in the conflict. Despite this steady drift toward Putin's positions, the Trump administration has yet to secure a single tangible concession in return. When pressed during a recent interview, Trump's lead negotiator, billionaire Steve Witkoff, failed to name any Russian compromises or even any that the U.S. had requested. The consequences of President Zelensky's disastrous White House visit have thrown U.S.-Ukraine relations into a state of crisis with little hope for immediate repair. While some hoped that experienced officials like Secretary of State Marco Rubio or National Security Advisor Mike Waltz might guide policy back toward a more balanced approach, both have echoed the administration's harsh stance toward Kyiv. For his part, Zelensky insists the partnership can still be salvaged, but rebuilding trust will be an uphill battle. The larger question now is whether Trump's apparent eagerness to engage with Putin will yield any real progress or simply encourage further Russian aggression. So far, the Kremlin has offered nothing in exchange for Washington's concessions, suggesting Putin is content to wait for more. Meanwhile, with U.S.-Ukraine relations at a breaking point, the risk of intensified Russian military strikes looms large. In response, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer hosted a critical meeting on Sunday with European leaders and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. The group devised a unified strategy to counter Russia while preparing for the possibility of diminished American support. The leaders agreed to several key measures, including sustaining military aid to Ukraine, increasing economic pressure on Russia, ensuring any peace deal safeguards Ukraine's sovereignty, and involving Kyiv directly in negotiations. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer and European leaders also pledged to strengthen Ukraine's defense industry and explore a coalition of the willing that could potentially include troop deployments to guarantee security. Starmer stressed the importance of U.S. involvement, stating that Britain, France, and Ukraine would present their joint plan to Washington, hoping to salvage transatlantic cooperation. However, concerns remain that the recent Oval Office confrontation between President Zelensky and Vice President J.D. Vance was marked by abrupt hostility, and a canceled rare earth minerals agreement was deliberate. The breakdown has forced European leaders to confront an unsettling reality. Under President Donald Trump, the U.S. seems increasingly willing to sideline Ukraine in favor of closer ties with Moscow. With Washington's commitment in doubt, Starmer and French President Emmanuel Macron have taken the lead on a new European effort to stabilize support for Kyiv. While repairing the U.S.-Ukraine relationship is still the preferred outcome, contingency planning is now essential. The stakes are high. If Trump refuses to re-engage with Zelensky, halts military aid, and pursues unilateral diplomacy with Putin, Europe and Ukraine would need to forge a self-sufficient partnership. European nations have the economic strength to sustain Ukraine, but lack the defense production capacity, a gap that could be offset by Ukraine's battle-tested military. One immediate step would be for the EU to finally unlock the estimated $300 billion in frozen Russian central bank assets, redirecting those funds to Ukraine's defense and reconstruction. Even if Trump withholds American weapons, European leaders could still negotiate arms sales by appealing to the president's transactional instincts. A more troubling question looms over NATO. Vance's dismissive rhetoric toward Ukraine, combined with Trump's long-standing skepticism of the alliance, raises fears that the U.S. security guarantee may no longer be reliable. While NATO remains foundational to transatlantic stability, recent actions from Trump's repeated concessions to Putin to his administration's refusal to condemn Russian aggression at the UN suggest a stark departure from traditional U.S. leadership. European members and Canada must now consider accelerating defense integration independent of Washington. The coming weeks will test whether diplomacy can mend the rift between the White House and Kyiv. This is especially critical as Trump prepares for potential direct talks with Putin. Don't you think Russia's leader has given nothing in return for American goodwill, while Ukraine's survival hangs in the balance? Let us know in the comments what you think of this proposal, and if you want to stay on top of this, smash that like and subscribe button.